Hi, this is a recording of a conference talk I gave at the Participatory Autism Research Collective, or PARC, an acronym for short, Critical Autism Studies Conference at London South Bank University in June 2019. The title is Demand Avoidance Phenomena, Pathological Demand Avoidance in brackets, and an ethical challenge to its orthodoxy. Yes, I have previously recorded audio files for this presentation, but I have reviewed a presentation and updated it from about 20 months ago to add more information that's come to light since then, and kind of just a currently kind of understanding on stuff. It is essentially still the same presentation with maybe about 15-20% more material added to it. Essentially, I'm including this slide in it because this is a link to the previous version, the previous recordings of it. I should include a link to it in the description. I tend to set out my kind of bias and kind of background towards giving a talk on demand avoidance phenomena or pathological demand avoidance at the start of each of my talks, so that kind of the audience is aware of my own kind of biases, and I think that's just good practice. So I do need a PDF profile, but there's several of them in print, so I'm quite specific. I tend to meet Elizabeth Noosa's one because the wording of that is kind of very particular on it. So I tend to prefer the name Demand Avoidance Phenomena for quite a few reasons, which I will kind of go into later in the talk. I'm not particularly huge fan of the current evidence base for DAP. There's multiple reasons for this. It tends to be quite small, and it also tends to be quite poor quality. And one of my concerns is it doesn't seem to be standing up to me kind of just poking around it or my mod scrutiny on the topic, which is kind of highly concerning. I should also point out that DAP itself is highly contested, so it undermines the credibility of all DAP experts, and that includes me. The abstract that was submitted into the 2019 PARC Critical Autism Studies Conference was based on a rejected article into the journal Autism. But at the last minute, I kind of reconsidered everything and chose to present a different talk. So I just fed up of just always saying negative things about DAP. So I wanted to put down an outlook, a perspective that I think most people could accept. I'm not pretending it's going to make everyone happy because it won't, but it's kind of like something that most people could accept on the topic. And I'm talking about because there's multiple different perspectives on it, and multiple different outlooks. Some people don't think DAP should be diagnosed, some people think it's autism, some don't think it's autism. And so I just put forward an outlook which most parties could accept. As I said, I do want to say good things about it. I'm kind of a bit, as I said, in relation towards the previous side, I'm still quite unhappy at how it just does not seem to be standing up to my scrutiny of it. So introduction into kind of content, into content of the talk. So I'm going to be introducing the main DAP discourse, how different DAP stakeholders are vulnerable groups, how I think DAP should be conceptualized as a comorbid to autism, but not a form of autism. Also, how the research, the priorities of different autism stakeholders, and how that kind of fits into wider kind of research agendas in autism. And I'm going to kind of end up with kind of closing remarks to kind of tie it all off. I have touched upon this previously, but there are multiple reasons why I tend to prefer to use demand avoidance phenomena to pathological demand avoidance. but one key reason is that there is a substantial demand in the DAP literature to change its name. Many people have written and expressed displeasure at the pathological descriptor, putting it mildly, which includes Elizabeth Newson, which is kind of highly ironic when you start to think about it. It's also kind of ironic that the fact that many of the DAP proponents are resisting the kind of the opinions written in literature of the people who dislike the pathological descriptor. There seems to be almost a pathological demand avoidance to changing its name. But yeah, I'm hoping to provide other reasons for my preference for a name change throughout the talk. Yes, there does appear to be a main discourse around that, despite it being highly controversial and highly contested. There does seem to be a certain amount of key authors and organisations taking a particular outlook on a topic, so they tend to prefer calling that pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance. They tend to view it as a distinct entity or syndrome within the autism spectrum. They seem to be calling it a profile or a subgroup now, not so much a subtype, which is an interesting kind of language and terminology around it. And one of the rationale for this is that DAP has different strategies to more straightforward or more traditional autism, essentially. Yes, as I said previously, there's several different behaviour profiles in the DAP literature. I have aggregated them together in a different kind of publication, but more recently, key kind of DAP authors and key kind of DAP organisations are only portraying 6 diagnostic traits for it, and they tend to omit the developmental traits in particular, which is quite interesting. So here's the 6 that kind of often appeared in literature, especially in 2019. Is kind of comfortable in role play and pretend, continues to resist and avoid ordinary demands of life. I tend to find that one to be highly subjective and kind of cultural bound. What is ordinary it differs from person to person, different culture, different lived experience. As part of this kind of demand avoidance and resisting ordinary demands is the demand avoidance behaviours will use social strategies, which kind of feeds into the next one, which is a lability of mood and impulsive. So this is kind of often kind of excessive mood swings that can be quite instantaneous. And the next one is obsessive behaviour that's often focused on other people. And the final one is kind of surface sociability, but kind of lacks a sense of social identity, pride, or shame. The wording for these traits can vary quite substantially. More recently, they've taken on a more autism-like characteristic. So, for example, the bottom one, surface sociability, is they've kind of removed the phrasing of lack of sense of social identity, pride, or shame. They just tend to say it with a lack of understanding. For example, so yeah, I'm not entirely too sure why the rationale behind it is, but from talking to some people who are involved in kind of discussions around this, the changing of the wording from their perspective is to kind of well, they just say that the wording it changes and evolves, and actually is part of kind of use in everyday language evolves naturally for everyday use and everyday practice, is what they seem to be saying. My perspective is I get the impression it's been deliberately changed to make it more autism-like and to remove aspects that kind of suggest that DAP is not autism. But this is a separate talk to kind of go into full ins and outs of that. Yeah, despite my concerns over much of what's said about that, I do think there are several credible points about it, and some of them are actually relatively good aspects about what's going on with it. as a kind of social construct and how it's operating. So yes, one of the two main arguments put forward for DAP's clinical use is that it helps to provide a better understanding to some individuals' kind of actions and support needs, and the other one is that it has bespoke strategies that each person with DAP actually needs. So I do think it does provide some explanation to people's behaviours. So I think that is a credible point of it. Another key point about it is that it is bringing some autistic people together into quite a supportive community. I didn't kind of appreciate just how beneficial this has been to some people until I read Harry Thompson's book in 2019. I also it's very kind of eye-opening, kind of just listening to how kind of how important and how powerful an experience it was for him to want to get a sense of understanding from that provider he was diagnosed with it, and also when he found out like the wider kind of autistic people who kind of identify with DAP. So yeah, those are kind of two good points about it. I do think it's credible that the people who identify with DAP or are diagnosed with DAP do require appropriate support strategies, which I'll kind of go into later. Most DAP supporters do mean well. This is despite the kind of the controversy around DAP and how it's highly contested. Most of them do mean well because most of them are only trying to help individuals, and there are many highly vulnerable people who either have DAP or care for people with DAP. So the sixth point how I think is credible about it is that the support strategies for DAP are generally good practice and they are quite strong. One of the criticisms of DAP is how it's being used to basically access good quality and good practice support strategies by kind of caregivers. But I'll go into kind of what these are later and what they and the kind of strategies stuff that they overlap. But the last point is the community for DAP is highly supportive. So if you're involved in it, you will find many people who will give you advice and kind of is very welcoming to those who kind of embrace the main DAP discourse and kind of view it as a distinct thing and think it's real and wholly kind of buy into it. People like me who are highly critical of it, a lot less so. But these are kind of 7 areas I think are highly credible. Yeah, the other side of the coin of things that I think are credible is there has been a lot of conflict around DAP, and especially towards those who have expressed things that go against the main discourse. There is certainly an issue of internalised ableism going on. So internalised ableism is defined as when an oppressed population or demographic group of people internalise discourse that's used to oppress them and then re-emit it internally within the population. There are a number of ways in which is kind of manifested in relation towards DAP. So there have been conspiracy theories going around. One of them is that I have a narcissistic personality disorder, which I don't think I have, and I'm not particularly interested in being assessed for it. There has been a defamatory petition to have David Milton fired from the National Autistic Society, which was highly distressing for Damien to experience. So there has been quite a lot of this has taken a toll on certain people just discussing it and researching it and just kind of propagating DAP in different kind of ways. There have been attacks on individuals by kind of various supporters or detractors from DAP. I mean, I've been told that in an email that, for instance, some people targeted Vincent Egan because his research suggested that DAP is not associated to autism. This is an issue, and I think to some extent that you are expected to kind of have quite a lot of conflict going on when people are kind of becoming emotionally invested in in a construct of DAP, either for their own kind of personal identities or kind of group identity, or to underpin the support packages of their loved ones, because of the strategies associated with DAP. There has been name calling, such as, for example, Miltonsplaining has been levelled at Damien Milton. There have been secret documents circulated to respond to critique. I've known that there's been one responding to me because my blog, as part of the natural package for it, it kind of tells you links people use to kind of click onto your blog posts and stuff, and one of them was these secret documents, so I just saved it. I myself am kind of having guilty of some of these internalising, so I have interrupted certain speakers when I was becoming too agitated because I felt they were just talking nonsense, harmful nonsense, I would say, in some cases, and misleading vulnerable people, which I'll kind of discuss in a bit, kind of reasons why. I am sincerely sorry for when I did this, and I have apologised to one speaker in particular about it. There is also surveillance of people critical of DAP. So, like, whenever I attend PDA conferences, DAP conferences that National Autistic Society hold, people do kind of observe me and take notes on me and that kind of stuff. I know because they've literally thrown stuff at me and accused me of it online on social media. I've been told that somebody monitors my tweets on the topic. I've had someone threaten to sue me, but they kind of backed down when I kind of pointed out the less than spectacular nature of their own case and how I can substantiate what I say about that, because I tend to root it in the literature and kind of carefully consider and reflect on what I say about it. And that has been picked up by certain peer reviewers. So, yeah, it's not great, the kind of contested nature of it and the effect it has had on some people. So I'm kind of setting out the general position, which I think most people can accept about it. I will point out that my views have become more in line with this. That's more because the more I've understood, more read around that, more kind of just accepted that I don't think it is autism. I think this actually should be the default position for most people advocating its use. So I think that's viewed as a comorbid to autism, but it's not inherently itself a form of autism. There's other points to be made, such as like decisions around the ontology, nosology, and aetiology around that need to have a robust evidence to inform policy and practice. I don't think that's particularly controversial. Certainly is substantially a bit more better than what's currently going on. Yeah, the DSM-6 and the ICD-12, they're a generation away. There's no real point kind of making decisions on anecdotal evidence at this point. We know this because both the DSM-5 came out in 2013 and the ICD-11 came out in 2018. So, yeah, I mean, we've got time to kind of thoroughly research that. There's no point kind of rushing stuff. Yeah, research should be transparent to all stakeholders, and kind of we're meant to be in a service user or kind of lived experience led research environment in relation towards mental health and even with autism. So the research agenda should be led by those who identify with that, those who lived experience, and they should be involved in all stages of research. And yeah, I would refer to its working name as Demand Avoidance Phenomena, because we don't inherently know what it is, although I currently view DAP as a new type of mental disorder that should be placed within the OCD and related disorders diagnostic grouping. That's a topic for another day. Yeah, there should be substantial caution around how DAP is portrayed and how it's kind of, and the information given around it to various stakeholders. We know that various stakeholders involved in DAP are vulnerable groups, and how this is portrayed in the literature. There are a few of them. The first one is autistic person themselves. I know from my own ethics processes from both NTU and SBU that autistic person count as vulnerable groups, and I think most people would accept that. The second one is obviously persons without themselves. again, this is obviously kind of likewise kind of often portrayed in literature, and also I would kind of argue that caregivers of persons with DAP are vulnerable people themselves. The reason for this is that the behaviours around DAP can be quite extreme. So not even if they're using the excuses to avoid demands or kind of physically incapacitate themselves, they can sometimes be violent. They can sometimes threaten to kill themselves. They can sometimes do quite extreme behaviours, such as one example from lived experience I've heard recently is of a young child with DAP pouring water down behind the sink to flood out the electrics to avoid demands. So yeah, these can be quite extreme behaviours for anyone to live with and express directly from a lived experience perspective. So it's important to kind of be supportive and to validate the lived experience of people, but also to recognise that I don't like the term challenging behaviours, but the kind of the difficulties that can be found by the behaviours being presented in DAP. There is some research that indicates that caregivers of DAP have higher anxiety than those of autistic, those of caregivers of autistic children and of caregivers of those with conduct disorder. This exact research has not been published in any detail. It's just referencing one book, and it's referenced in passing, so I can't comment on it more than that. The other point to recognise is that autistic people and DAPers themselves are known for internalising various discourses, and we know from the DAP literature itself that both autistic children and young persons are saying that DAP is a form of autism, and that many persons who are diagnosed with DAP or self-identify with DAP are saying that it's a part of the autism spectrum, which is highly concerning considering its contested status. So yeah, ethically we need to be careful what we say about it and how we portray it. Yeah, I touched on a couple of these points in a previous slide, so I'm going to expand on it to kind of say you can the caregivers themselves and the persons with DAP are kind of vulnerable for a couple of other reasons. So especially when you're dealing with people who are potentially traumatized or have been through aversive experiences, and we know from especially for the autism literature and lesser extent to the DAP literature that a lot of autistic children and a lot of DAP children themselves will have aversive experiences in educational settings. And so we have issues around kind of emotional contagion. So that's when the emotions that one person expresses despite all time can be transmitted onto those around them. So if someone's highly anxious, you can make people around you highly anxious or highly stressed and that kind of side of it. You can also have issues of vicarious trauma, so you can traumatize people just by kind of triggering people's trauma responses or if they're talking about it and that kind of side of it. So we do kind of need to recognise the vulnerable nature of some of the stakeholders around that and not only support them and validate them, but also kind of be more responsible in how we portray it and how we discuss it. Yeah, I mean, these are a few points I don't think they shouldn't need to be stated, but they actually apparently do need to be stated for various reasons, which should become clear throughout the remainder of the talk. But yeah, policy and practice requires good quality evidence, and as I kind of said previously, I don't have time to kind of go into why much of the PDA, much of that literature and much of the research about it is poor quality and circular. That in itself is a separate talk, which I will probably provide in the next 2 or 3 months, the details why. But we kind of have an ethical responsibility to kind of ensure there's good quality research to underpin policy and practice around that. We should also, as researchers, be attention to disprove our hypotheses, not produce research and evidence that supports our own outlooks and stuff. And that just can't be said for some of that research in particular. Yeah, this kind of the final point is kind of what I've been saying a lot over the last couple of slides, is that we should be providing balanced and accurate information around DAP, and we just often, a lot of people just aren't doing that. They're just saying it's part of the autism spectrum, and that's just not good enough. Some of the slides later on, I'll be quite clear that from nuisance work, it is very hard to say that is autism. And this information isn't given to people, it's just not adequately explained. So yeah, do you think certain organisations or certain key components should be doing a lot better in how they're portraying and be a lot more balanced in it as well? Yes, this is a problematic statement by arguably the world's leading DAP expert. Phil Christie helped Elizabeth Newson put forward the case for DAP as a pervasive mental disorder. He has more subsequently himself viewed it as part of the autism spectrum. But he tends to end his conference talks with this quote. So I will quote it in full. So it is to build on the developments, insights, and increasing recognition of PDA, but maintain the integrity of how the condition is understood and the nature of support that is needed by individuals. That's the end of the quote. I kind of put in the slide that you should see flaws of it, and I don't really want to go into it too much because I have written about issues with this quote and gone into quite a lot of detail elsewhere. I'm not a huge fan of it, just because from my own kind of particular outlook and philosophy towards stuff, it just seems to contradict it a lot. But I will stop here. Yeah, something that is overlooked, I think, quite a lot in the DAP literature is that the arbiters of clinical practice and what kind of mental disorder is grouped in what diagnostic grouping are not autism charities, because often the DAP literature say it's recognised by the National Autistic Society or the PDA Society to be part of the autism spectrum. The simple response to that is it's that the place of the the publishers of the and authors of the TMA Diagnostic Manual, so the American Psychiatric Association and the World Health Organization, both write and publish the DSM and the ICD. I'm not going to pronounce their full names in this talk, but the point I'm making here, it's for these bodies to decide if DAP is, for an example, a false form of attachment disorder, which was kind of suggested in Dave Milton's deconstruction, that PDA supporters thought that the APA would view that to be a false form of attachment disorder. It kind of just go around how mental disorders, how their diagnostic groupings can evolve and change over time. It's kind of recognised that autism used to be viewed as a form of schizophrenia, which it no longer is. Autism itself has evolved quite a lot over the last recent decades, from being a form of schizophrenia to being part of the pervasive mental disorders to being its own distinct spectrum mental disorder. The last point is not as strong as it was when I made it, because the arguments around it is that due to the strategies used for DAP, it should be viewed as a particular distinct thing, should be on a particular diagnostic grouping. The problem with this is that most strategies or interventions or approaches tend to be issues or symptom specific. So they're not. You don't tend to have specific strategies associated with particular diagnoses. So, for example, social application issues will tend to have social stories, and social applications are quite common. They're not specific to autism. They can be found with people with attachment issues, or for example. It's one that I'm kind of mentioning, but also kind of noting that it's not as relevant as it used to be. Yeah, sorry, I'm just finding it amusing, the joke at the top. That's not TV. It's a line from the TV series House, where he's trying to his patient is a doctor who specialises in TB, and the patient has TB himself, and House is basically changed the environment in the room to trigger something that's not associated to TB, and he kind of goes and he turns into a video camera because the patient is displaying these symptoms during a press conference. So House just goes in to shout into a camera, "That's not TB." There's a bit of background reading. There's a background to the kind of the joke at the top. Yeah, the core impairment of DAP is believed to be high anxiety. Many authors state that high anxiety kind of causes the demand avoidance and some of the other behaviours and some stuff. Elizabeth herself did not directly attribute that behaviours to anxiety. She described some behaviours as being related to panic or fear, and later authors have associated that as being high anxiety. The first time in the DAP literature that the behaviours are associated with anxiety is in Phil Christie's 2007 article. And this is quite easy to prove because all you have to do is just search or use defined functions in PDFs and stuff, and it just turns out that Phil Christie's the first one to associate DAP with anxiety in print. So yeah, the next logical point extension of this is that anxiety itself is not an intrinsic part of autism. A lot of autistic people can be made anxious by their environment or how people are treating them, or high anxiety itself can be sourced from a co-occurring condition such as an anxiety disorder or anxiety itself being diagnosed. And anxiety disorders and anxiety-based disorders are quite common co-occurring conditions to autistic people, and anxiety itself is almost one of the most common co-occurring conditions to autism, being common in about up to 50% of autistic people. Yeah, but the point is, if DAP's behaviours are mainly being driven by anxiety, and anxiety itself is not an intrinsic part of autism, it's pretty straightforward logic that DAP is not a form of autism. I wouldn't say it's within the autism spectrum. It should be external. I've already said previously, I think it should be viewed as any type of mental disorder that's placed within the OCD and related disorders diagnostic grouping. I'll explain why in a later talk, because I'm preparing a blog post on it, and I'll produce a video for it as well. The next few slides are important to why DAP should not be viewed as part of the autism spectrum. And the main reason for this is if you engage with Elizabeth Newson's scholarship, like her work, what she's written over almost 3 decades, over about a 25-year time period, she basically never viewed DAP to be part of the autism spectrum. She quite consistently says that it's not autism. She expresses certain views quite consistently over a 20-year time period, so you could wonder some of them are you could wonder if Newson's has been dogmatic over certain instances. But if you kind of connect the dots, it's quite clear that you should not be assuming DAP is part of the autism spectrum based on Newson's work. And this is important considering most DAP literature, most DAP research is based on or derived from Newson's clinical descriptions, or tools that are based on Newson's clinical descriptions, and etc. So yeah, so it's been pointed out by Liz Nyans in her PhD thesis that Newson never systematically investigated autism features amongst her cohort. That should be kind of a clue that Newson isn't interested in making DAP a form of autism. She does other things like she screened her database for cases that showed autism features and even atypical autism features, and excluded such individuals from her database. One important thing to point out about Newson is that she herself was an autism expert and was involved in diagnosing autism and conducting autism research since the early 1980s. one key study which is mentioned in a book that was edited by Dr. Thrift in 1981, is that Newton's clinic diagnosed 80 autistic adults based on trial of impairment, and these cases were diagnosed as A-ward autism, or it could be described as Asperger's syndrome. It's kind of quite important because if you pay attention to Newton's work on PDA, she never based PDA on the trial of impairment or conceptualize it along understandings of autism. She consistently kind of did not group PDA in the autism spectrum because she thought that the autism spectrum was too narrowly defined, and also that she felt that her own diagnostic groupings were more useful to laypersons and other stakeholders. And Newton did know what the trial of impairment was, because if you look at her latest diagnostic group in 2003, she draws autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome as based on trial of impairment, and she doesn't draw specific language impairments or PDA as based on the trial of impairment. So this statement is valid. Newton also said that PDA needs to be significantly different from Asperger's syndrome and autistic disorder, which were the two main autism subtypes in the DSM-4. And she said that her research supports that statement. And I'd point out that if DAP is based essentially around anxiety and anxiety is driving these behaviours, it would suggest that DAP is represents a clustering of features and behaviours that are separate from autism. I would argue, and there is multiple research studies coming out saying that DAP behaviours are either associated or predicted by anxiety. I don't have time to read kind of explain the full literature base behind that. But yeah. Yes. So as mentioned on the previous slide, that Newton said that DAP is not a part of the autism spectrum, and she consistently said this in her first publication on DAP in 1983. She said that persons with DAP are not autistic. She didn't explicitly say it in the 2003 article, but she did explicitly state it in the support material for it, that DAP is not part of the autistic spectrum. It's a pervasive mental disorder, and that it would be a mistake to call DAP an ASD. And she kind of gives a logical reason behind this in it. She said it would be like calling an entire group based on the name of one person in the family. Is her kind of logical rationale behind it. DAP itself is based on 4 clinical descriptors. In the 2003 article, what's often given by Phil Christie's conference talks is that DAP is often based on descriptors for developmental disorder and pervasive. But if you pay attention to Newton's work, she consistently views DAP as being based on a 4th descriptor, which is coding. So coding is when a person has issues with certain aspects of communication, either verbal, written, or kind of cultural aspects linked to it. So kind of aspects such as like pride and shame and a sense of like social identity. And Newton kind of says this consistently from 1989, even including 1986, because Newton's first diagnostic grouping she created in 1986, so 2 years before she created her first DAP behaviour profile. She explicitly questions what is DAP's coding issues in the diagram for this diagnostic grouping, which she made up her own diagnostic group in 1986 called the Pervasive Mental Coding Disorders. And in her various other works, even if it's a 2003 article, she states that all kind of persons with pervasive mental disorders have coding issues. So it's quite important to kind of mention this 4th descriptor that DAP is based on. I personally don't think DAP has coding issues, and I explained why in a blog post in quite great detail. That I don't think it remains to be seen if there's credible evidence that DAP has coding issues itself. A lot of the reason for this is because the one diagnostic trait that's associated with coding issues and kind of social communication issues, many of its features are either arbitrary or don't directly measure the coding issues they're meant to have, or some of the features are actual horribly high, such as panic attacks. So yeah, it should also be pointed out that not all of the DAP cases in Newton's cohort or her database would have been diagnosed with comparable forms of autism or atypical autism, or the residual categories for autism at the time were pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified or atypical autism. It is noted in Newton's work and in Phil Christie's 2007 article that not all the cases that were diagnosed with DAP by the Newton Centre would have received an equivalent autism diagnosis. So it's kind of fair to say that not all of Newton's database were autistic. I think I should also point out that Newton screened her database for autism features and then and the kind of excluded cases that showed it. I did mention on the previous slide. Yeah, I will also add that when the studies that compare the kind of diagnostic criteria from DSM-4 to DSM-5, they consistently show that the people who are less likely to get DSM-5 diagnosis are those who do not conform to stereotypes. So that is people with Asperger's or people who were diagnosed with PD-NOS. These also tend to be demographic that would tend to be diagnosed with DAP. So we can say that those who tend to be diagnosed with DAP would not conform to a DSM-5 autism diagnosis as well. I don't have time to go into ins and outs of this research and stuff, but yeah, I mean, some people do argue that all of Newton's kind of cases are autistic, although some don't. I would kind of mention that, like, for example, Eaton and Weaver would say that many of the Newton's cohort would have been diagnosed with a DSM-5 autism diagnosis. But the logical extension of that is, if not all of them are being diagnosed with autism, that means you have some non-autistic people in there, which, as I said previously, not all of Newton's cohort would have received an autism diagnosis under DSM-3 or DSM-4 or the ICD-10. Some people. It's also important to note that the DAP literature acknowledges that a pervasive developmental disorder, which Newton argued DAP to be, is clinically not the same as a form of autism, but they are similar, but they're not the same thing. So, for example, Christie kind of mentions how a lot of controversy around DAP is because it doesn't conform to kind of conventional autism understandings. And like Judy herself has kind of written in a 2017 book that Newton's cases do not fit kind of classical autism kind of presentations. Yet by kind of today's standards, by the National Autistic Society, that presentations would fall within the broader autism spectrum, but they're not clear how they're defining that, or why they necessarily do. They're just kind of just saying that. I would point out that Newton and Christie both do quite clearly state that while pervasive developmental disorders are similar to autism, they're not the same thing. That's quite important. As I said kind of previously, if Newton's research is not viewing DAP to be part of the autism spectrum and that they're not autistic, which he consistently kind of says and does. If you also kind of pay attention to Newton's work, there's multiple reasons that make it problematic to view DAP to be part of the autism spectrum, and this is kind of noted in some of Visserman's earlier work. So it's kind of stuff like the manipulative behaviours around associated DAP are not associated with autistic people. The gender ratio associated to Newton's work is not associated with autism. The strategies associated to some of the aspects of the DAP strategies are not associated with autistic people. So like the use of kind of like novelty and humour and role play, for example, aren't associated with autistic people. There's a couple of points I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but the point I'm trying to make here is that one should not be making the assumption from Newton's work that DAP is part of the autism spectrum. Yeah, people are, which I'll stop there. Yeah, so moving beyond Newton's work, there are various comments and research suggesting that DAP has no feature behaviour that is unique to the mental disorder, so that basically its behaviours and features are seen outside of DAP. It we should also point out that interactions between kind of co-occurring conditions and autism affect development of autism in autistic individuals. So this could potentially explain certain behaviours of DAP. Kind of more interestingly, more recently, as I kind of previously stated, the developmental traits for DAP are no longer needed for diagnosis, which means that if you don't need traits to be present from birth, that you can gain DAPA or develop DAPA at any point in your life, which would suggest that it's not part of the autism spectrum. So, and just for the record, which I've not said previously, the developmental traits for DAP are passive early history, delayed speech development, and neurological involvement. The arguments for removing it is because it really stems from the identifying DAP features with the DISCO paper, so an IONS et al. 2016a. They tried to make DAP a meaningful subgroup of autism, so they were looking for features that were specific to DAP within the autistic population. So they felt that the developmental traits were basically seen in too many autistic people to make DAP a meaningful autism subgroup, and they chose an arbitrary threshold. So if the feature is seen in more than 30% of autistic persons, it was not useful to identify DAP with, which I have numerous issues with. But this is not the time or place to kind of go into. I do have some other comments that kind of add to it. Due to how autism and comorbidities sometimes interact with each other, often many co-occurring conditions will present slightly differently outside of autistic people. So, for example, Jonathan Green et al. 2018a kind of talk about how anxiety disorders tend to present differently in autistic people and how to have different kind of causes for their behaviours. But at the same time, we don't have like an autistic anxiety disorder. We just have a generic anxiety disorder, anxiety disorder profiles within the diagnostic manuals. What this means is that DAP probably presents differently in non-autistic people, but there would only be a single DAP diagnosis and behaviour profile for it. So I would point out that you might have specifiers for DAP. So you might have you might specify what kind of areas of functioning are impeded by demand avoidance. So you could say like social or kind of occupational or educational, or you could just say pervasive, so just all features. So all kind of areas of a person's functioning are kind of impaired by demand avoidance, for example. Yes, multiple kind of empirical studies suggest that DAP is associated to high anxiety, or its behaviours are predicted by high anxiety. So, for example, an IONS DAP model for how the behaviours kind of present and develop over time and become habitual, due to the cause of its being high anxiety, causing the demand avoidance behaviours. I'd point out that behaviours of demand avoidance can be seen in outside of DAP, so it can be seen in kind of models for depression, such as the Fisher's flower, which is kind of derived from anxiety disorders. And many of the experience accounts also suggest that kind of DAP demand avoidance behaviours are associated or from fear or anxiety of potentially negative situations, which I said is potentially if a rigid and repetitive behaviour or interest is due to fear or something, or due to anxiety, it is not linking that is a differential for it not to be part of the autism spectrum. So if a behaviour is due to fear or anxiety is something happening, that would be associated to anxiety-based constructs such as OCD. So yeah, an example off the top of my head, I think from PD Hayes would be a person kind of given their kind of cards, like their credit cards or bank cards, over to their partner because they're fear of kind of spending too much money, for example. That's off the top of my head, I might be wrong. It's been 2 or 3 years since I read the book. But yeah, it's worth kind of just pointing this out. Other studies that indicate that DAP has anxiety would be an IONS 2014b B, sorry, as the correct one for it is. So it's a small sample. So you had 25 persons with PDA were kind of screened with the strength and difficulties questionnaire and another tool, but the results indicate that DAP can be described by association of autism, conduct problems, and anxiety. So it can be viewed as a form of triple hit. Research by Michael Obsessive's clinic suggests that DAP can be predicted by anxiety and conduct problems, and is not predicted by autism. And I think it might be predicted by ADHD. Off the top of my head, don't quote me on that one. So yeah, they're the main ones off the top of my head. You've got the so the Sturt et al. Paper looked at intolerance of uncertainty, anxiety, and found that intolerance of uncertainty mainly drives DAP behaviours, but intolerance of uncertainty can drive some anxiety, and that anxiety can in turn drive some DAP behaviours. But it's a cross-sectional study. We need to have longitudinal research to probably identify causes of DAP behaviour. Yeah, many clinicians have noted that DAP is seen outside of autistic persons. And I have multiple clinicians say the same stuff to me privately in emails and on Facebook messages and other bits and pieces. There is empirical evidence to kind of support this. Not much, because not many people are. Most research views PDA as part of the autism spectrum, so most PDA research tends to involve only autistic population samples or entirely suspect autistic population samples. But some small scale studies and some population studies, some studies that use snowball sampling do indicate that DAP is seen in non-autistic persons, or that DAP is not predicted by autism. Most well-known one is Kaushik, which basically found DAP seen in 11 persons out of 25 participants, and that 8 of them were not autistic. There are a few case studies. There are a few individual cases of non-autistic people being diagnosed with DAP in the literature. So there's one in Riley et al. 2014, which is 4 case studies of people with epilepsy, and one of them did not meet the threshold for autism but had a DAP diagnosis. There's one person who is not diagnosed with autism in the validation in quotation marks study for the DISCO paper. I say that because it's not actually validated, and the paper even says that. One of the 27 people who met the threshold for DAP did not have an autism diagnosis. There is another one off the top of my head. Yes, one of the cases from Liz and I. So Liz and I's PhD thesis has 2 empirical studies, one quantitative, one qualitative. The qualitative one had 14 participants in, and one of them did not meet threshold for autism, and was diagnosed with attachment disorder. They were assessed with the ADOS and had a total score of 1, which is incredibly low on the ADOS score. So basically, this person is non-autistic. Another good one example is Trundle et al. 2017. The case study for that was only assessed for PDA and was only assessed with the 5 Ps method. So they didn't even use a screening tool or semi-structured interview to do it, even though there were semi-structured interviews available to them if they asked people. This case study in particular had signs of attachment issues. Behaviour had a history of substance abuse, diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia. Off the top of my head, I've been told by Grace Trundle that the ADHD diagnosis has been removed, but it's important to note that dyslexia and dyspraxia have been noted as a cause for DAP behaviours. So yeah, it looks like that this case study where Grace Trundle is not autistic, which is quite interesting. I cannot officially say that this person is not autistic because he's not been assessed for autism, but from my understanding and from talking to Grace Trundle. But yeah, it's quite. There is a relatively good case that that DAP is seen in non-autistic people, relatively speaking. There's limited evidence for it, but quite a few people have said in literature that it's seen it in non-autistic people. I'd also point out that obviously nuisance case studies probably are not included in non-autistic people. I'd also argue that the validation study for the EDA-Q contains non-autistic people in, because they had 2 PDA groups, one that was diagnosed with PDA and one that was not diagnosed for PDA. But both these PDA groups were placed in suspected autistic people, but they included people who were not diagnosed with autism but had potential indicators. The problem with that is, mainly at the time that this sample was collected and research conducted was 2010 2012. PDA was mainly diagnosed as a separate construct. So currently PDA is mainly diagnosed as a dual diagnosis. You're mainly diagnosed with autism plus PDA traits. This was not the case in 2010 2012. So due to the fact that PDA behaviours overlap, like attachment disorder and other conditions, it's possible for people with attachment disorder to meet the clinical threshold for autism but not be autistic. So due to this, it's kind of, and other reasons which I'll go into a separate talk, I think that sample includes non-autistic people in, and it kind of explains why you're detecting PDA in non-autistic people, if it's been validated, if the EDA-Q has been validated to detect PDA in non-autistic people, which I do think it has been. I should point out there's also many developmental pathways to DAP. So, for example, Elizabeth Newson mainly thought that people with PDA have passive early history, or that was not universal. About 12% of her cases had active active kind of PDA, and I think Judy Eaton's research database for PDA has multiple developmental pathways in, from how it's been described and reported from my understanding. So Judy Eaton presented her research findings initially in the 2018 PDA conference by the National Autistic Society, and she reported having a number of false positives from her perspective on the EDA-Q, which is the main screening tool for PDA. And it has been used to diagnose PDA in the literature, even though it's not really meant to be used in that manner. I would question if all those are false positives, because Judy and her clinic tend to view PDA as a form of autism, and they only diagnose PDA in autistic people. So they will naturally view anyone who, by a false positive, is basically when a person meets threshold for PDA and EDA-Q but would not get diagnosed with it. So in this case, it'll be kind of people, either autistic people, but mainly non-autistic people who met a threshold on EDA-Q but did not receive PDA diagnosis because they weren't autistic. Because I've been told by Eaton that they only apply the PDA diagnostic tools to those who think have PDA, and they only really do that they think PDA is only seen in autistic people from talking to Judy Eaton. So that is very circular research, but it also explains why they're kind of potentially seeing false positives. My point is that they may be overlooking actual positive identifications of PDA if you assume PDA to be seen outside of autism, because of diagnostic overshadowing. So diagnostic overshadowing is when you do not look for a mental disorder or a kind of condition or a mental disorder social construct, because you're too busy attributing behaviours and features of it to another condition or another mental disorder. So you could explain these false positives as a result from diagnostic overshadowing from the diagnostic practice, from helpful psychology. I think it was Christopher Gilbert who mentioned that there are autisms, so that there are not just one form of autism, but there are multiple separate individual autisms within what is called autism. So autism is expected to be a heterogeneous condition, spectrum condition. So some people think you can break it down into individual, distinct autism subgroups or syndromes. So you could argue there are multiple kind of demand avoidance phenomena. So there's multiple kind of PDAs or DAPs. which is kind of because I previously called that demand avoidance phenomenon, but due to how I think it might be multiple things, I changed it to phenomena for plural. Something that is often overlooked in discourses and discussions around DAP is that the age of research that we're meant to be in a highly inclusive and highly participatory research for not only for autism but with wider mental health research. So research is meant to be kind of led by survey users and those by lived experience. And this has implications for how you conduct that research and how you view it and how you engage with it. The literature notes that DAP is mainly driven by non-autistic stakeholders. So it's mainly driven by caregivers, autism charities, and clinicians. And this has traditionally been the case and is mainly the case even now. So there are issues to consider. So it's recognised that DAP is not diagnosed universally across the UK or anywhere close around the world. The literature also acknowledges that DAP is mainly a UK-based construct. You can say it's kind of culturally specific to the UK, and this has been mentioned in one of Liz and Iron's recent articles. The implication of this is that many thousands of people with DAP are not diagnosed with it, and this includes autistic and not, particularly relevant and pertinent to those who are not autistic. So their needs need to be kind of accounted for, and perspectives need to be considered. There's reasons why I tend to use person first language with DAP. That's to highlight that we're not consulting non-autistic persons with DAP's views on the topic, and they might prefer person first language to identity first language, which autistic people with DAP tend to prefer. They tend to use PDAs or DAPers, which I sometimes call them. It's quite important that citizen power requires transparency. So researchers across all stakeholders need to be kind of transparent with what research is doing and engaging with all stakeholders, and especially those with lived experience, at every step of the way, including both autistic and not. So this is important. So a lot of the kind of research and a lot of the kind of clinical guidelines are kind of coordinated or kind of suggested by the PDA development group. The PDA development group is a group of about 8 to a dozen people. The reason why I don't know this is because the information isn't necessarily public. They tend to be quite hidden and quite private, and it's one of my issues with the PDA development group is that it's all behind closed scenes. But it contains representatives from PDA Society, National Autistic Society, the Elizabeth Newton Centre, the Lorna Wing Centre. It has Julie Eaton on it, Phil Christie, probably Ruth Fidler, and some of the people on there as well. But they basically set kind of guidelines around best practice for what they consider to be PDA, and they set information of DAP on like National Autistic Society website, or at least they did up to a couple of years ago, and they probably still do. They're probably the 8 people who they consult, who NASI consults for their information on DAP. But yeah, they would also set kind of the research agenda for various PDA conferences. Though NAS have said that they've stopped allowing them to do that, although that remains to be seen officially. But basically, this group, the PDA development group, it's clinicians and caregivers and many clinicians, and there doesn't appear to be any lived experience diagnosed with DAP on that group, and that is an issue. So key kind of groups and kind of policy groups need to have lived experience representation on board. Yeah, there's something that's often overlooked when talking about DAP, especially as a form of autism, is that all previous attempts to divide autism have failed, both on the behavioural level and both on the biomarker level, both on genetic and other biological factors. And this has been noted quite clearly in the autism literature. As soon as you start to discuss about subtyping autism, just empirically and clinically, it just falls down. So you have issues with people with autistic people transitioning between subgroups, both over lifespan and in different situations. You have issues with the spiky skill profile. Autistic people kind of you get different responses from us doing the same tests repeatedly. So we don't reliably replicate the same results. is one issue with it. Apparently, there's no evidence of differential treatment between autism subtypes, and that autistic people also lobbied the committee that set the DSM-5 autism criteria to remove subtypes to prevent. So a key study, so 12 specialist autism diagnostic clinics in America basically looked at their diagnostic records and how they diagnose autism subtypes under DSM-4, and basically found that the best indicator for what subtype of person diagnosing was what individual clinic they actually attended. So the logical argument for this is that the subtypes were not being consistently applied in clinical practice, and that certain subtypes are being used to try and reduce stigma that an autistic person would experience. So, for example, Asperger's is associated with less stigma than autistic disorder. So autistic people lobbied to have subtypes removed from the DSM-5 to prevent autistic people from to reduce stigma that autistic people reduced. This also kind of fitted into how out of 100 studies investigating kind of differences between Asperger's and high functioning autism, they basically found that the differences were due to the kind of research methods or circular diagnostic practices. So basically, there's no difference between Asperger's and high functioning autism. What this means is that if you're going to argue for PDA to be an autism subtype or subgroup or anything subdividing autism, you need to have an exceptionally high quality evidence base, because you have a substantial amount of evidence saying that you can't divide autism successfully, so you need to have an equivalent amount of evidence to contradict that, and that's why I'm saying it. And PDA just doesn't have anything close to that at the moment. What it also tends to mean is that any evidence that suggests that PDA is different to autistic people would automatically mean that PDA is not autism. The flip side of this is that if you're trying to put PDA into diagnostic manuals as something that's not autism, you need to have kind of typical quality evidence base. If you're viewing PDA as a non-autism comorbid. I kind of mentioned this before, like the DSM-6 and ICD-12 are a generation away. We might as well take time to thoroughly and rigorously conduct scientific method-based research into PDA to inform policy and practice. Going on to research agendas, again, most autistic people do not want autism to be subtyped or divided or to be placed in the diagnostic manuals. A lot of autistic people just like the kind of use of kind of functional descriptors, so kind of low functioning, high functioning, kind of severely autistic kind of people. There's a lot of issues around such terminology, how they use and how they kind of conceptualize how to use in practice. Because of that, a lot of autistic people just don't want autism to be subdivided, and I've mentioned previously around autistic lobbying to have subtypes moved out of the DSM-5. This was done by ASAN, so that would have been the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, sorry. So going back onto it, if you check kind of known kind of lists of priorities for autism research that involved autistic kind of feedback, PDA and subgroups and subtypes are just not mentioned or included at all, which means that kind of research in PDA as an autism subgroup is contradicting autistic kind of population's wishes. That kind of should be kind of understood and kind of taken about. The other point to mention is that the UK itself is known for having quite low autism funding levels compared to other countries. Although it has slightly improved since 2016. In 2016. So what you can argue is that conducting research that conceptualizes PDA as an autism subgroup or part of the autism population kind of contradicts community wishes and also detracts research attention and research resources from meeting kind of the priorities of the autistic population. This is a huge kind of ethical thing to kind of consider and be discussing, and no one really has addressed it in the PDA literature from my understanding. If you're going to move outside of the even with the autism literature, but also if you're going to go more broader literature, so kind of looking around inclusive education literature, all stakeholders tend to want better services and support available for autistic people and people who support them, so especially around kind of caregivers and support available for family members. This means that there isn't really kind of conducting research to make a new subtype or a new subgroup just isn't a priority of many stakeholders. I mean, you can argue that research for kind of DAP strategies is a priority of many stakeholders, but DAP itself and research kind of make it a distinct thing within the autistic population is not it. I've kind of mentioned before that many people are pointing out that DAP strategies are just good practice, and that many kind of non-DAPers would benefit from them. This has been said by many people, pointed out by many different people. I should kind of probably point out what the DAP strategies include. So they include kind of positive working relations with people, kind of using humour, kind of forgiving people, providing kind of 2 or 3 choices for the DAP person to choose, from, to negotiate with them, to have positive working relationships with them, to use multiple kind of methods of communicating with them, to kind of view much of the behaviour as related towards anxiety and panic. DAP traits themselves are related towards anxiety management. So you would aim to reduce demands you place on them. You try and match demands and requests of them to their anxiety levels, so what they can tolerate in a particular different moment. And there's a strong overlap with quite a few different conditions and approaches. So yeah. Yes, so it's argued by some DAP is an ASD supporters that DAP is needed for use in clinical practice to protect persons with DAP from receiving reinforcement-based approaches or behaviourist-based approaches such as ABA such as applied behaviour analysis or positive behaviour support. It's also kind of noted that such automatic reinforcement-based approaches are seen in common caregiver strategies that are seen for disruptive behaviour disorders. But the articles that tend to discuss this also can mention that DAP behaviours and mechanisms for DAP behaviours are seen in non-autistic persons, such as other kind of neurodevelopmental disorders, although I don't view DAP to be a neurodevelopmental disorder. The authors of these arguments would point out that DAP would have different mechanisms. DAP in autistic people will have different mechanisms and such different causes for displaying its behaviours. I would point out, as mentioned earlier, that this would be to be expected as autism would interact with DAP, and therefore DAP would probably present differently in autistic people compared to non-autistic people. You'd also point out that non-autistic persons with DAP would also be exposed to automatic reinforcement-based strategies and approaches that are used with disruptive behaviour disorders. So the logical extension of that argument is that you'd also therefore need DAP to be diagnosed in non-autistic persons to protect them from reinforcement-based approaches. Likewise, arguments around that DAP is needed for some autistic people to explain their behaviours. The argument will also be applicable to non-autistic persons with DAP because their behaviours can be seen in non-autistic people with DAP and have similar kind of similar cause mechanisms, such as being highly aroused and highly distressed. I'm particularly referring to a Nions and Neons 2018 rebuttal article to Malcolm Baird as discussing these points. Yeah, there are a few kind of quotes or sayings that advocates for DAP as an ASD kind of use to try and kind of reduce debate around it or to justify using it in clinical practice and diagnosing autistic people. One of them is this quote of Goldberg 2019 that Phil Christie tends to use in his conference talks. So I think there is a spelling mistake in it because I think it should be practitioners, not practitioners. It's missing a second T, but the quote is both ICD and DSM focus more on the reliability than the validity of disorders they describe. Goes on to say that no iteration of either the DSM or the ICD has acknowledged a fundamental distinction between researchers and practitioners, and then goes on to say, so basically, who uses diagnostic classifications and for what purpose? I've put the quotes in italics, but when you engage with the slides by Christie, the words that are kind of italics are kind of validity, reliability, who and what is supposed to place emphasis on those words. The implication of this quote is that it means that any stakeholder can use any diagnostic mental disorder, any diagnostic category or entity in any particular population if they think it helps some people. It doesn't even necessarily to help the people being diagnosed with it. It could be to help the caregivers. One things that you kind of experience when you engage with literature around mental disorders is that is the kind of child or young person causing issues for caregivers? If so, then therefore this is justification for diagnosing or pathologizing certain behaviours. This argument is this quote by Gilbert, and the implication for it is also applicable for diagnosing that in non-autistic people, which is the reason why I'm mentioning it. Yeah, I discuss in an article which I will have to put a link in the description to how the DAP strategies are good practice and why they're good practice, and I provide a kind of list of what kind of what strategies and approaches they overlap. A new book has come out recently kind of mentioning similar points to me, so like how universal design is applicable for persons with DAP, and how trauma-informed approaches such as low arousal approach are also applicable for persons with DAP. But the different kind of approaches that overlap it include kind of autism catatonia ones, autism preferred strategies such as kind of person-centered approaches, the capabilities approach, dielectric behavioural therapy. So I need to update that actual wording. Evidence-based practices. So Jonathan Green et al. 2018b a list several kind of evidence-based practices that overlap the PD8 ones, because one of the arguments against using DAP in clinical practice is that comparable strategies and approaches have been used with autistic people independent of the DAP label for years. I personally don't think DAP is needed in clinical practice, but I accept it's not going to go anywhere. And the kind of the realpolitik of the situation is that it's here to stay. I think it's pretty silly to argue against it. The horse has already bolted, unfortunately. The spell framework also overlaps that, because Damien Milton, who helped kind of develop the spell framework by the National Autistic Society, argues that kind of routines and structure should be done on the autistic person's kind of terms and negotiated with them. And if you kind of engage with Elizabeth Newton's unpublished work, she kind of it's quite clear that like 60% of persons with DAP in her sample did kind of routines. So there is kind of overlap with that kind of stuff. The dialectic behavioural therapy, DBT, has been aspects of it have been used by Judy Eaton's clinic with persons with DAP, so she mentioned that in her book. And so yeah, inquiry-based learning is something that's been used in HE and in primary and secondary settings. That overlaps DAP approaches because you basically give the pupils as the individuals, so you kind of teaching options to what kind of activities they do, and they go around and basically kind of lead the session themselves and try and teach other people aspects of what they're taught and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that's all of it. Yeah. So yeah, I'm kind of a bit excited because I've been kind of recording these recordings for about 2 or 3 hours and I'm getting close to the end. So we can start the summary. I prefer the terminology for demand avoidance phenomena, not pathological demand avoidance. I think DAP is comorbid, but not part of the autism spectrum. I think DAP carers are a vulnerable group, as well as DAPers themselves are a vulnerable group, and autistic people are a vulnerable group. transparency and inclusion for all stakeholders is important to allow lived experience, so people who have the app to have citizens' power in the DAP research and in DAP practice and stuff. Yes, policy and practice decisions require good quality evidence, and we currently don't have much of that relating towards DAP. Unfortunately, we need to have much more scientific method-based research and much more, or much less circular-based research. I think we need to have a discussion around what kind of evidence thresholds we actually require around DAP. I have set out what evidence I think it has elsewhere in a blog post, which I'll probably turn into a video at some point. I'm planning on turning most of my blog posts into videos, because a lot of it I kind of point out kind of important, pertinent stuff over it. I should point out that now that much what I've said is my kind of personal view, though originally I set out this conference talk 20 months ago, I was aiming for a position that most people could accept and live with, not necessarily be entirely happy with. But I don't know. I do hope that it's kind of stimulates debate. Yeah, I kind of need to provide acknowledgements on for this conference talk and stuff. So one for kind of Park for allowing me to kind of present at a conference at LSBU 2 years ago. I'd like to kind of thank Damien Milton's original deconstruction essay on DAP in 2013, which kind of sparked. Well, I was really critical of that before I kind of came across Damien's work, but his deconstruction essay forms a basis or a starting point for much of my own critique of DAP. I'd like to thank the peer reviewers for the journal Autism when I submitted it. They gave some quite positive comments about it. It was mainly rejected for the writing style and how I basically crammed too much information into a 2,000-word essay. That's a tangent. Everyone who is also obviously supporting academic work. I did invite various DAP stakeholders to comment on the points that are raised and to try and contribute towards debate on the topic, although they kind of neglected to respond in most part. Yes, so the PDA Society did respond privately to the slides, but they declined opportunity to comment publicly on them. I do kind of wonder what kind of thresholds are required here for certain DAP is ASD supporters required to kind of change their views. I do wonder if they're just never going to, regardless of what is said about it or what research comes out or whatever. I mean, the PDA site themselves have changed their banner of the website to part of the autism spectrum, so that kind of indicates where they lie on it. I've had feedback on to the talk, and generally it has been quite positive, so I'm quite grateful for that. But I would prefer more feedback on it. This is a cheap plug for an autistic-led journal that I currently am running as acting chief editor. I'm not really sure what's going on with it, but it's open access. It's Autism Policy and Practice. If you're interested for more information about it, you can either contact me or access the link below. This will be the final recording of the slides. The rest of it is, I think, just bibliography and references. So these are my contact details if you wish to contact me to discuss anything or the slide or find out more of my information or more of my work. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Is there anything else I'm going to ask or mention? No, that's pretty much about it, really. Thank you for your time, and I hope you found it useful. Sorry, I need to add that most of the references are in alphabetical order, except for I've added 4 or 5 new ones to the end, primarily because I seem to have missed a couple out when I done the referencing first time around, and I've reference some new material since then. So instead of just reorganizing the references in individual slides, I just added a new slide with the references on. So yeah,